All right, welcome back to Firewall. I'm your host, Bradley Tusk. It's a Tuesday episode. With us is our friend and producer, Hugo Lindgren. Hugo, how you doing?
I'm good. Bradley, I have a question for you right off the bat.
Yeah.
So in our house this weekend, we had the news on pretty regularly, which we've almost never. It was like the first time in a long time.
Yeah.
Like maybe election night sometimes we had it on.
Yeah.
But we just had it on. And it was such a throwback. You know, we're obviously monitoring the LA situation. We have friends there, and we were obviously concerned, like everyone else, about what's happening. And it was funny. It was both kind of like there was something kind of almost nostalgic about it, like, oh, here, we're all going to gather around and find out what's going on in the world. But also it was so frustrating because the sort of performative nature of the news, which hasn't changed really that much at all. In fact, it just seems like weirdly exactly the same. But like it's so dissatisfying to like be.
Well, that was so. I did not have the TV on, but Laurel tried.
Right.
And she said it was so stupid. It was CNN. She said it was so stupid she had to turn it off.
I don't. What I wonder is has the quality of the actual like the people and the sort of presentation declined, or is it just not kept pace, or what is the?
Here's what I think it is. So I think there's always the exception of a talented person on any given network, whatever, who is a really good anchor or a really good host or whatever it is, right? And they're popular and they're talented. Putting that aside, it's a little bit like reality TV in that people on reality TV today are not actually behaving in their realistic way. They're engaging in a simulacrum of what they believe a reality TV contestant is supposed to do. So like when we were in our 20s, the first reality show that I really remember was The Real World.
Yeah.
And that came out. And part of what made it, we were in our 20s, so it sort of felt more relevant, but also what made it
people were our age.
Fun. They were our age, but also like they didn't know how you were supposed to act on it.
Right.
So they just acted like real people, and that made it interesting. Or even Top Chef, I used to watch it all the time, and then I tried maybe last year putting it on, and I didn't really enjoy it at all. And I felt it was sort of the same thing, which was all the contestants had seen 20 seasons of Top Chef at that point, and they were acting the way. I think the same thing is true. Like I think same thing. Cable news has been around now for a couple of decades, and I think it's the same thing. So it's totally performative, and it's just a watered down derivative version, and it's not very good.
Did you ever watch New York One back in the day?
Oh, I loved it.
So I remember like Pat Kiernan's in the papers, which was great because it was just kind of digressive and like sort of ad hoc, and like he just sort of did it, you know. And I remember I watched it. I didn't watch it every morning or anything like that, but I did enjoy it when I saw it. And the other day, they fucking still do it.
Yeah,
like the newspapers are like, what are the newspapers?
Right.
Even?
It's hard. I don't even get New York One anymore. But it was when I was at the Parks Department. They were like our best sort of like target all the time because they would cover like a playground opening or whatever it was. And I became and because everyone who worked the desk, it was brand new, was the same age as me, basically. Right. I became friends with them and started hanging out with them. And in order to be better at my job at Parks, I spent a day on the desk at New York One being like a producer of, you know, like assignment editor. Like I was.
Did you do anything, or you were just like hanging out?
No, I was doing stuff, and it turned out to be the day of the OJ verdict.
Oh,
so it was very busy. Actually,
I remember where I was.
They were happy to have an extra set of hands.
Nobody was watching New York One though.
No, but it was fun. It was really fun.
Everybody was on CNN then. That was for sure.
Yeah. So anyway.
All right. So Laurel also founded.
Yeah. Same thing.
Okay.
So here's the plan for today.
Go ahead.
We're going to talk about LA. We're going to talk about TikTok. Supreme Court heard arguments on Friday. We're going to talk a couple of New York things, congestion pricing and universal school meals. Then we're going to bring Bob on and talk about Meta's decision to end human fact checkers, to which you might be surprised, but Bob is actually strongly in favor of. So we're going to have a conversation
in favor of ending the fact checkers.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and I think he has kind of brought me around a little bit on it too. Or I have like a slightly divergent view, but you'll see.
It's funny. I would have thought you were all in favor of getting rid of the fact checkers, but anyway, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So let's start with the LA stuff.
Yeah.
We obviously just touched on it at the beginning. It's been, I guess it's almost been a week now.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like it's over.
No, but what I did was I wrote up 5 points relevant to our kind of expertise, not just for us to sit here and do what the anchors do and just rehash the stats and, you know, the human tragedy and all that. And no one listens to this anyone who listens to this podcast is aware of what's going on in the news in general, so they don't need us to do that. So I had sort of 5 political observations that I wanted to share. So the first one is I just don't see how this is the result of operational bureaucratic mismanagement. Like, yes, of course, agencies can always be managed better. Of course, you could always be more prepared. Of course, you can find stuff. But overall, when you look at the scope of the fire and then the things that are being blamed, the two just don't add up, right? Like the 2% cut to the fire department budget, a 2% cut to any budget is not going to materially operationally shift anything. So it's not that, right? Newsom protecting the smelt fish, as stupid as that might be, did not result in there being insufficient water in the reservoirs. Yes, the fire hydrants in the system didn't have enough water, but that's because it just isn't equipped to fight 4 massive fires.
Do you think most people in LA understood that like, because I mean that idea of like the fire hydrants not having water
No,
in
it
them?
sounds horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is, it's funny because in the first couple of days I was like, how could they possibly let the fire hydrants? And then, like, when I was writing this and I started really looking into it, I was like, oh, how could they? I mean, unless you want to assume we're going to have 4 uncontrollable massive fires at the same time, and we need enough water for all of that, like, you wouldn't have that, right? And then Bass being in Ghana, like, clearly wildly unfortunate that she was there, and even worse in that turns out she pledged not to do all these trips abroad when she was running for mayor, and then
was this an issue that like mayors were constantly going off?
I think
so
the problem was that
she's
she's a career politician in a legislature.
Right.
She's never run anything, and Congress members love free trips. That's like a big perk of their job.
Right.
And she, I think, was on the Foreign Affairs Committee and took full advantage of it and just traveled constantly, so that it was an issue, and therefore she pledged not to do it. And then she went to something, and there's not even like any stated business purpose for Los Angeles and her being
she just
there.
wanted
Right?
to
It's not
there.
like LA is competing for the Olympics and you're at the IOC meeting somewhere, right? This was just, she was, on a Biden delegation, total junket. But with that said, it had nothing to do with starting the fire or fighting the fire, right? Nor was the fire department or anyone else waiting for her direction specifically around like, go to this block and put out the thing, not that block, right? So like, again, the point is, there's a lot of stuff to point to, and there's going to be a lot of really, really serious political fallout from it. But in terms of if you're just trying to be honest and look at it, it is not. It's a combination of bad luck and climate change, and I'm sure some operational stuff, maybe some of the stuff around the power grid covers and things like that. But overall, I don't think it's accurate to say that the fires are because of and I'm not big on DEI, but it wasn't because of DEI.
No, of course not.
It wasn't because.
But she did, as you would obviously agree, miss an opportunity to be the real. The comparison to 9/11 isn't obviously apt in lots of ways, but still in that moment you had
That's why she's toast, which is our next point. So there is nothing that defines the public's view of a politician, not even close, than how they handle and respond to an emergency, right? Whether it's Rudy Giuliani, who was, having been around him, a lot during 9/11, was pretty amazing in that period. Or, Bloomberg, his sort of worst time as mayor was he handled generally operational stuff incredibly well. And then there was one snowstorm in 2010 that they totally bungled. He had hired a guy, Steve Goldschmidt, to be deputy mayor for operations, who really had no business in that job at all. He was a policy guy. And Goldschmidt was out of town, and they screwed up every single thing. And Mike's numbers plummeted. And that was one snowstorm. We probably handled over 13 years.
Right, sort of late, like literally 8 years into
another dozen really well, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
So, the way you handle that, which is why I think Bass, so LA has recall, as we know, California, you can recall politicians. So
we do know that.
15% of registered voters in the city of Los Angeles, so that's 323,000 signatures. So there's already a Change.org petition that had 100,000 signatures. Now, how many of those are valid LA voter signatures, I don't know. But basically, when you're doing signature gathering, it costs about $10 a signature in terms of the labor you have to hire to collect it. So, and you need more than the exact number because people sign Mickey Mouse or Buzz Lightyear, or they're sign it, but they're a LA County resident, but not LA City resident or whatever it is. So you probably need to spend about $5 million. But if that $5 million is spent and it goes to the first question is just whether or not to recall Karen Bass. Absent some miracle that I just don't see how it's feasible, she's gone. So the minute someone, and so the obvious guy is going to Rick Caruso, who has run for mayor a couple of times, has held various kind of public offices, is a billionaire real estate developer, owns the Grove, which is a popular mall in Beverly Hills, and could easily fund a $5 million recall effort, and that would be the end of it.
Is that how it works? The actual guy who wants the job funds the recall?
Well, usually the guy that wants the job doesn't have the money to do that, right? So,
but in this case,
he does. Or, if you're some incredibly wealthy person and you're incredibly angry, might you give $500,000 or $1 million to that effort? Yeah, and then you need 5 to 10 people, right?
If this were in your backyard, would you be calling for this?
I don't know. Look, I just said I don't think any decision that she made specifically caused the fire or materially changed the response to the fire. But look, generally speaking, I'm not a fan of career politicians with no executive experience running a city government and all the operational functions. But the one thing to note here is the mayoralty of the city of Los Angeles is exceptionally different than, say, New York or Chicago. It's an incredibly weak mayoralty. The council is much more powerful. So if you made, just use New York as an example, a pie chart of power in city government, under a strong mayor, meaning both in terms of the statutes and then sort of their actual abilities, like a Mike Bloomberg, 90% of the power lay with the mayor. Under an Eric Adams who's weak, it's a lot lower. But overall, whereas in LA, the council has a tremendous amount of power, and then also two other things. One, LA County has a tremendous amount of both power and jurisdiction, and a lot of the places that we think of as LA are not actually the city of Los Angeles. So Beverly Hills or Santa Monica. So these places that have high tax bases and need much less in the way of social services and all that, the kind of net producers to the system aren't actually part of your city. Yeah. So it's not as nearly as an attractive job as, say, mayor of New York, because you can't achieve as much. So what I don't know, but I would say that I can't imagine somebody won't do this, and I can't see a world where she could possibly survive. And then the next step would be, assuming she is recalled, a special election that takes place 60 to 110 days later. And one thing you and I were discussing yesterday, I think, is, okay, so who steps up in that situation, right? So the obvious answer is Caruso. He came reasonably close last time, so I would imagine that if he wanted it and was willing to put the money in, he would very likely win. But as you pointed out, you made the case to me yesterday to say, Bloomberg only wins in 2001 because of 9/11. Otherwise, Mike loses by 25 points to the Democratic nominee. So is there a sort of less traditional person? So two names that pop to my mind, and this is just me speculating with zero knowledge whatsoever, would be Casey Wasserman, who is running the Olympic bid. His grandfather was the great Lou Wasserman. MGM, was that his studio?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, so like one of the true legends of Hollywood. We'll get into the Wasserman, I would argue, we will in a moment. It's going to have his hands full anyway, just in the Olympic side because of all of this. Another thought was Ari Emanuel. So his brother was mayor of Chicago, and a pretty good one, especially compared to Brandon Johnson and Lori Lightfoot, the last two mayors. Has politics in his blood, is a good executive. I have no idea whether he'd want to be it. I don't know if he'd be any good at it, but that was another name that struck me because it's interesting.
It does sound like that's the TV show plot line right there.
Yeah, maybe so. Like a Hollywood studio exec becomes mayor.
Yeah,
that's not bad. So because if it
gives me a cold chill a little bit.
Like Mike Bloomberg came out of finance, right? That's the main industry in New York. The main industry in Los Angeles is entertainment. So and the studios or the agencies are big businesses, right? So the notion that someone from that world, if you're running a multi-billion-dollar business, you're certainly operationally qualified.
Okay, so just I know we're in purely speculative mode here, but do you think the Emanuel brothers have been burning up the phone lines on this?
I don't think Rahm is capable of talking about anything but politics 24/7.
Right.
I'm not sure if Rahm's capable of talking about anything but Rahm 24/7. Right. So whether he could be diverted enough to actually consider the existence of another human being in the world, I'm not sure. But, if Rahm thinks it's good for Rahm, I'm sure he's all over it.
I mean, you mentioned this, and I think it's true, that the difficulty, the reason that this probably wouldn't happen is that one thing about L.A. is that no one gives a shit who the mayor is when you're there. And it's like the newspapers, too. It's like you'd see the L.A. Times like piled up in people's driveways and just be like, obviously no one cares about the newspaper here either. So talented newspaper editors tend not to go to, the L.A. Times, just as like talented politicians tend not to want that job.
So we'll see where it lands. But it does also seem like, because Caruso does seem to want the job, that was an obvious one.
So the Olympics are supposed to be.
We'll get to that. Or we could jump ahead.
Okay, I thought we were.
We're at number 3. So Bass, number 3, is independent of the fact that she will I would argue, most likely lose her job anyway, has a huge immediate management problem, which is her fire commissioner, Kristen Crowley, came out and told a local Fox affiliate that the budget cuts were a massive problem in fighting the fires. So now you have a fire commissioner who has directly undermined you in public and put the blame at you. Maybe she believes that. Maybe she's just passing the buck herself. Hard to know. None of us ever heard of her until a few days ago. You can't fire the fire commissioner during the blaze. But you also, and on Saturday, the two stood together and tried to sort of have a public rapprochement. But if you're the mayor and you don't get rid of her as soon as you possibly can, what you are telling every other commissioner and every staffer and everyone else is, you do not need to ever listen to me about anything because I won't do anything about it. So feel free to ignore my directives. Feel free to criticize me. Feel free to disagree with me in public. And you have lost all control of your administration. So I would argue that as soon as the fires are out, she's got to behead Crowley. And by the way, you can also pump a lot of blame on her, except the problem is she's Bass's appointee in the first place, right? If you're Bass and you're the mayor, you're responsible for fire departments, you can blame the fire commissioner, but at the end of the day, the buck stops with you. That's number 3. Number 4 is...
our good friend Gavin Newsom.
Yeah. So, look, is there any evidence that Newsom's policies really, despite the best efforts of the New York Post and others, really led to any of this or hampered the firefighting? No, none at all. But here's the problem. When voters go into the ballot box writ large, in my experience, at most they carry a few things in their head. A visceral kind of reaction to the candidates, the party that the candidates are in, and the party that they're in or not, and like 1 or 2 policy views or issues or things they know.
A headline
right?
they remember something.
That's it, right? It's no one is sitting there with like a long policy checklist.
Pros and cons.
Yeah, pros and cons, right? So, and the problem is the most definitive thing about California in years are these fires, right? And that's 100% of Americans are aware of it, pretty much. And when Gavin Newsom runs for president, and if you're a governor, the through line when you run for president is, I worked miracles in my state, and now I'm going to do that for you, all of America, right? Even if you can argue that Newsom has been an effective governor, I think there are arguments for it, there are arguments against it. But even if you can argue that, people know that the fires in LA were very, very messy, caused massive damage. And unlike, say, an earthquake where there's really no one to blame, in this case, a lot of blame is going around. They'll probably see Karen Bass be recalled and lose her job. And so I think that given that so much of a presidential campaign is the narrative, and that the narrative in many ways is more about perception than reality, I think Newsom's presidential bid's in real trouble.
But this is an opportunity too, right? So he pushed through the lifting of some of the environmental restrictions on development on the waterfront or on the coast.
Yep.
So this is a big crisis in his state. There is a scenario in which he stands up and does some good things.
He will,
right?
and I'm sure if he has to, and I'm sure he will, 24/7 just be about coming up with solutions to this. The question is, we're all aware of the fire. We're all aware of the blame game. We'll all probably see Bass thrown out of office. The individual stuff like lifting the environmental restrictions on building houses in the Palisades or whatever it is, you and I are really interested in Los Angeles, and we follow politics very closely, so we know this stuff, but I just don't know that stuff gets through to the average person.
I tried to bring it up before, but now we come around to the Olympics.
Yeah, how dare you go out of order?
Well, it was on my mind, so I had to ask. But could this be the opportunity? So this is going to happen, if it happens in Los Angeles in 2028, the summer of 2028, when Newsom may well be running for president. Yeah,
I mean, it was all lined up perfectly for him.
Right. So still could be in the sense that if Los Angeles gets its shit together.
If it's really rebuilt by then, yes.
Right.
Then it's sort of a perfect national stage. But,
there's a lot to go
all
for.
state canceled 60 or 70% of the fire policies right before this all happened, right? So if people don't even have clear claims to insurance to rebuild their homes, and then keep in mind, so it's right now, January 2025, so the Olympics are in 3.5 years. Maybe they will perform miracles in terms of rebuilding schools and homes and religious institutions and all this stuff, right? But maybe they won't. History says they will not. So yes, Newsom arguably has an opportunity to try to turn lemons into lemonade. But here's the other problem, which is, so the reason why LA is the perfect Olympic venue is it needs very little to put on the Olympics, right? So it has, the Rose Bowl and the Coliseum and SoFi Stadium, so track and football and all. I mean, not track, football, track and the Olympic ceremonies and soccer and all that stuff. It has the Staples Center or the Crypto, whatever it is now, and where the Clippers play. It has Dodger Stadium. It has where the Angels play. It has where the Ducks play. It has the soccer stadium. It has all the UCLA stuff. It has all the USC stuff. It really has kind of everything already, which is why, in some ways, from an economic standpoint, it's the most viable city to host the Olympics because they don't have to build very much, right?
Right.
So far, none of the Olympic facilities have been directly impacted by the fire. It sounds like the closest risk is the Riviera Golf Club, which is where they'll play Olympic golf. But, having just been there and played golf with Lyle a bunch of times, there are plenty of other courses that they could move to.
There
right?
are.
So it's not that big a deal. So that's not the problem. The problem is you still have to build an Olympic Village. You still have to spend a tremendous amount of time and money kind of preparing the city and the infrastructure for the Olympics. Normally, people are excited about that, right? And it's a good thing. Like when we were in Paris this summer for the Olympics, part of what made the experience so great was Parisians who are normally very grumpy and don't want you there all seemed, now we were mainly dealing with people in service capacity, but still just seemed happy the Olympics were happening, proud of it, it was going really well. And it just made the environment really lovely, And if I'm someone who lost my home, and I see the city and the state prioritizing housing for, Olympic athletes, housing for weightlifters or whatever, discus throwers, instead of me and my kids, I'm going to be really pissed off. Now, are they two totally separate things? Yes, of course they are.
Well, but they, this is where the inflation comes in, right? Because the construction of housing that's going to have to happen with the state coming in and having to do these things, or not the state, but the Olympic Authority having to build these things. Good luck finding a contractor. Good luck finding building materials.
Good point.
The amount of economic difficulty here is unknown, but great.
Yeah. So that's going to cause a huge backlash to the Olympics. And then, even if the Olympics can be sort of pulled off, if the Olympics go on, and even if they're well run, and I suspect they will be, but the city has not been rebuilt, I think there's going to be so much anger and resentment that people there are going to at the games are going to feel it, not enjoy it. Yeah. Two, you're a media guy. The narrative would constantly be the contrast between the destroyed city and the beautiful Olympics. Now, maybe NBC, whoever the host is, won't do that because they're invested in promoting the Olympics, but the rest of the media will do that. I just think that the minute a city turns on hosting the Olympics, it is very hard to pull it off, and that's what's going to happen.
Can I ask you one final question? Because just obviously 2 weeks ago, we talked about your time in Los Angeles and how much you enjoyed the city and want to spend more time there, possibly even live there part-time.
Yeah.
Do you think, and this is obviously speculation again, but does this change the sort of where Los Angeles, it's obviously an incredible magnet for people to move there. Yep. It's really an attractive place to live for so many people. Do you think this fundamentally changes that, or is it just kind of like?
I don't know. I was talking to Blake Zeff, and he lives in New York, but he's lived in LA. He's a political guy, but he's also done a lot in the TV and movie world. And so we were talking about this, and we were saying, okay, so here's the problem. So New York has really terrible weather many months of the year, and all kinds of worse right now than before, but all kinds of crime, quality of life, all the stuff we complain about in this podcast constantly, right? But it's still New York, and it's exciting. LA has massive natural disaster problems, whether it's wildfires or mudslides or earthquakes or whatever else.
Floods.
And then also crazy traffic, right? But it is still a city that is incredibly vibrant and exciting and innovative. So you could live in one of those two cities with the drawbacks. You can live somewhere else and maybe avoid all of those drawbacks, but then you're going to be bored, right? So your choice is bored, natural disasters and traffic, or really cold winters and homeless people, pooping everywhere. Like, those are your options.
Okay. Well, we'll keep talking about those options. Should we talk about TikTok?
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't you just give the lay of the land to start with where you see the TikTok situation developing?
Congress last year passed a bill, bipartisan overwhelmingly, that required divestiture of ByteDance, which is a Chinese company that most believe is controlled by the Chinese government, owning TikTok. And if they don't do that, then TikTok is effectively banned in the U.S. And when they say banned, they don't mean that the app goes dark that day. What it means is U.S. hosts, so the Apple's App Store, Google Play, the internet service providers, everything else, can't in any way offer updates. And in an app like TikTok that's 100% video-based, they have to constantly improve the underlying tech and the algorithm. So once a month or two goes by and you can't update the app, it's going to stop performing well. And then people will stop using it, because the point of TikTok is that you get your stuff in 7 seconds. And if it takes 32 seconds to load, you're not using it. So TikTok effectively goes away. The TikTok has been fighting this argument in court and saying that their First Amendment rights were denied, and therefore the law is unconstitutional. Trump, when he was president, was for divesting TikTok, then flipped because I think, one, he thought TikTok was helpful to him in the presidential campaign, and two, some of his biggest donors are major shareholders in ByteDance, and he came out on the other side of it, and I think even wrote an amicus brief to the court. But the Supreme Court heard the arguments last Friday, and based on all sort of court watching, the judge, the jurist questions, justice questions during the arguments, everything else, it seems highly likely that the congressional ban will be upheld, which means on January 19th, TikTok effectively either must be sold to a U.S. company, or it effectively will go dark. Now, Trump has something like the power to do a 90-day pause.
Right, I was going to ask about specifically what he's got.
So I guess he could do that. That pause could maybe last long enough to help ByteDance and the Chinese government decide what they want to do, but it's not going to change the law itself. So absent Supreme Court really radically shocking everyone. And by the way, keep in mind, this is a court that has, so on this podcast, we all the time rail about Section 230, people who have been incredibly harmed by content on social media platforms have sued Google and Meta and others, and Twitter, and the cases have made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And consistently, the Supreme Court says, look, we get it, but Section 230 is very clear. Congress passed it. Our job is to rule on the constitutionality of laws, and this law is constitutional, so therefore the platforms are protected. Or we've talked on this podcast about the case last summer that the court did that ended the Chevron deference, which effectively was a policy that allowed agencies to make a lot of administrative rules and a lot of policy without congressional kind of action. And the court said, no, this is, these are mainly congressional decisions. And if Congress hasn't ruled on it, you, the EPA, can on your own decide what to do. But again, a very strong deference to Congress, right? So if you're going to defer to Congress in Section 230 and you're going to defer to Congress on Chevron regulatory actions and inactions, then it seems very logically consistent that you would defer to Congress on this too.
Okay, so the Supreme Court, let's say the decision goes the way people expect it. Well, does the Chinese government do something here?
They have three options, right? And it's hard. I'm certainly not in any position to predict what the Chinese government will do. But so
not in your brief.
No. So option one would be to have ByteDance sell it to a U.S. bidder. So there's only one sort of stated bidder at the moment, which is a guy named Frank McCourt, who's a longtime media executive. He owned the Dodgers for a little while. And he's put together kind of a group with the idea that it would be a kind of much more sort of sustainable, healthy, less toxic TikTok, which sounds pretty good to me. I don't know if they can execute on it, but it sounds good. And then more of the traditional buyers, so Oracle, Amazon, Walmart, companies like that. Because keep in mind, we're talking about as much as $100 billion purchase here, right? And my guess is the Chinese government isn't taking stock in Walmart, so it's cash. And then you also have to be able to get through the FTC, which is tricky because I guess Trump could try to deny that, but that wouldn't save TikTok, it would just basically mean the end of TikTok in the U.S. So China could choose to sell it. Or they could choose to say, you know what, let's just let it go away. And either one, we don't need $100 billion, so we're not going to bother and lose this asset in the algorithms. Or two, there will at some point hopefully be a larger deal with the U.S. around tariffs and trade and Taiwan and all these other things. And this can be part of that.
Okay.
And either we can get it back or we can then choose to make it a concession or whatever else. For China, I don't think $100 billion is that big of a deal that it has to drive all of their decision making, and they are very strategic and long term in their thinking. So, I don't know if I had to predict. The app basically is no longer able to be updated come next week, and it eventually degrades and probably goes away short term. And then, I would imagine some version of it comes back. But ultimately, one of the big reasons why someone like Mark Zuckerberg is so relentlessly kissing Trump's ass.
Because he comes out a winner here.
Yeah, huge winner. Because if TikTok goes away and it doesn't get replaced by, if TikTok itself isn't saved by some American company, then you have 170 million people looking for somewhere to go, and Instagram and Threads become the obvious destination. And so, whether it's putting Dana White on your board or ending fact-checking, which we'll get into in a few minutes, or paying, a pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago or giving millions of dollars to the inauguration or whatever else, Zuckerberg, if nothing else, is not stupid. And he had several major needs before the Trump administration. He wants Section 230 protection to continue. He doesn't want antitrust prosecutions. But the biggest one probably is the opportunity here with the demise of TikTok. And so it very well may be that the Chinese decide for now to just let it go dark, and Trump can't really do much about it, and maybe through lobbying by Zuckerberg and others. And by the way, Elon also benefits because he owns Twitter, and Elon, I'm sure, also would love to see TikTok go away. So all of that, if I had to guess, I think there will be a period where TikTok effectively will go dark.
Has Abby asked you about this?
Nope. I was with her over the break, and it never
Is she aware that
once.
it might be banned?
Probably so.
Because my kids were asking me about it last night, and what just was interesting to me is that if you think of like where would you put TikTok as a global brand right now? I mean, it was probably top 10, right?
Yeah, top
10.
5,
maybe.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Sure.
So the idea that you would has the Chinese economy ever created a consumer brand anywhere near TikTok? I mean, what's even in the conversation?
I mean, globally, no. I mean, Alibaba probably is.
Right, but you ask like a random American what Alibaba is. They have no idea.
Yeah.
Right.
No, probably not. Yeah.
So anyway, it's just interesting that this is a pretty incredible creation as a thing, right?
Yeah.
Like how many people go to create brands every day, and then you imagine what TikTok is today, and it might go dark, as you suggest.
Yeah.
It's
a fascinating story.
You want to talk a little bit about Governor Hochul?
A couple of New York things. So one is, I just want to thank and praise Governor Hochul.
Nice.
She put universal school meals in her budget. This would make New York the 10th state to do it. We were a couple of years ago able to run a campaign that was actually pretty rough on Hochul because she wasn't a supporter at the time. That led to $134 million in new funding that produced 300,000 more meals a day for kids who needed it. This finishes the job. There's another couple 100,000 kids still in need, and this would do it. So it's fantastic. I am grateful for it. We have taken out a bunch of ads on social media and other platforms and newsletters to thank Governor Hochul for her great work. I am reassured that Speaker Hasty and Majority Leader Stuart Cousins are fully on board. And so what that means is kids who right now don't have enough to eat. And again, if you were starting a society from scratch, I just don't understand how feeding kids wouldn't be in the top 5 or 10 things you would do, right? And so it's great. And then also, by the way, governors of Oregon and Washington both put it in their budgets. We'll see. We're polling in Oregon right now. The governor is so wildly unpopular that normally our whole strategy is to get it in the governor's budget, because if it's not, it's a very uphill fight. Now, in New York, a couple of years ago, Hochul did not put it in her budget, and we were able to still help get it through the legislature and make it happen. But that's pretty rare. But we'll see. So you have Oregon, you have Washington. There are some other states we're working on. But then in Arkansas, school breakfast, Governor Huckabee Sanders in a red state, which makes me really happy. So that's on the table. We're waiting to see if we can get this into Governor DeWine's budget in Ohio, a couple other states like Delaware we're looking at. So
a lot of momentum.
Last year was a really bad year for school meals. We basically failed absolutely everywhere. And this year seems like a major uptick, so that's great.
Speaking of Governor Hochul, congestion pricing.
I mean, so far so good, right?
You know, I guess I don't know. I haven't spent time in Midtown Manhattan, so I guess that's sort of the subways haven't miraculously improved yet.
No, and I was driving in an Uber in Midtown the other day, and I said to the driver, "So much for congestion pricing." But it was just like some van double park blocking the street entirely, right? Although in theory that van paid $9 extra to do that. So look, it does seem like anecdotally, it's a little better. I'm going to LaGuardia in a couple hours, and I'm curious to see if.
Where are you off to?
I'm going to Toronto. I'm speaking to the Business Council of Canada,
which
is like their U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Right. We'll have to ask you about that on the next
we'll have to do an emergency pod on that one.
Emergency pod.
And so,
from Canada.
So far so good. We'll see. Ultimately, Hochul has made a really big bet here politically that this will work, and that ultimately there will be less traffic, and that the sub-MTA will do a better job, and that will lead to kind of less crime, less violence, less fear, or less disgustingness on the subways. And, when she's running in her primary in 18 months or so against, whoever runs against her, if the subways are better, and if there's less traffic, I think that's a huge win for her, and it's really going to help her a lot. If there's still a lot of traffic and the subways still feel gross, then I think people are saying I'm paying this money for nothing, and it becomes a big political problem.
Well, I will say there's something kind of great about this scenario, because you're like, this is a real thing, right? Like this is like a policy that is needed in a lot of ways, whether it's the perfect policy or not, or whether people like it or not, we don't know. But this is like about our daily lives, about things that improve or don't improve, like day-to-day life. So I feel like we're at least in the right area for like judging someone like Hochul on her reelection. Like this is a real thing.
Yeah, it certainly is.
Okay, so we're gonna talk to Bob about
call Bob in.
He's supposed to log. He's supposed to just log in. I'm going to see if that works.
While that's happening, I will just give the backdrop here so that the listeners. So, as everyone is well aware, content moderation on social media is somewhere between difficult and impossible. Right? You just have so many billions of posts going up that to figure out what is harmful, what isn't harmful, standards for change all the time, and as a result, it's a total mess. There are sort of two levels, I would argue, of this part of what Bob and I will talk about, of harm caused, right? There is the true harm, right, which is, and we've talked about this a lot in this podcast, teenagers committing suicide, massive increases in bullying online, massive increases in self-harm, eating disorders, truly horrible things that I would argue that the platform should be very, very responsible for and held liable for. And the content moderation, in my view, around that is incredibly important. The stuff that tends to get all the attention, though, isn't that. It's sort of the political stuff. It's, conservatives complaining they're being censored, or liberals complaining about Cambridge Analytica, or whatever it is. And that's the stuff, because that's what reporters are interested in, that gets all of the lion's share of the attention. And so Zuckerberg, I think in part because, he's always been somewhat libertarian, and, but in part because he doesn't want to have to spend money on fact checking or be held accountable for what happens on his platform. And in part because he is kissing up to Trump because he wants TikTok to go away and other stuff like that, announced last week that they will stop having human fact checkers, and they will instead revert to the community, whatever that means, and AI. And, the outcry, outroar, whatever it was sort of predictable, that everyone will laugh, both because they think it's a thing that's helpful to Trump, was against it, and a lot of people like me who are very much in favor of protecting kids online and repealing Section 230 were against it. And then I remember talking to Bob, who I kind of just assumed would also reflexively be against it, but he wasn't. He was very much for it, and he'll explain why.
All right, so hang for right there
wait.
because we're going to...
Now we're trying to find Bob.
Yeah, we're good.
All right, so I already teed it up for the listeners, Bob. So what they know is that you surprised me when your reaction was very strongly in favor of the Zuckerberg decision. And so why don't you tell us why?
Sure. First of all, I'll break it down into the content we see on social media as being of two types, right? The first type is what I'd call the violent, threatening speech act stuff, which should be monitored, which should be moderated, which should be pulled as quickly as possible.
Give me
I don't think anyone's saying
examples of that, though, because I was trying to do that, actually make the same distinction a minute ago.
People being shot, decapitations, things that things that honestly AI should be dealing with in the first place, because they're the types of things that give human content moderators, PTSD.
Right. Okay. Yep.
Also threats, right? Threatening, like physically threatening people that are credible.
Yep.
Those types of things are already against the rules. Those should be pulled off immediately. They're not what I'll call the other side, and I think this is what everyone's getting at, is what I'd call controversial content, which is not stuff that's going to hurt someone immediately, but that maybe people will certainly disagree with, and some people's feelings will be hurt by. And some people will feel is insensitive, is unthoughtful, is provocative, obviously intentionally so.
Right. And when you say the controversial content is mainly sort of political and cultural in nature, yes?
Yeah, I think it could be artistic as well, but one way or the other, it's content that's not immediately hurting. It's not an act that's designed to hurt people, but it could be hurtful. It could be interpreted in a way, or it could be very clearly designed in a way that's designed to hurt.
Okay, so do you have a First Amendment view then so I think we would all, hopefully even Zuckerberg, agree that the first group of truly violent stuff should be caught and prevented from being posted, and that AI is the right application to do a lot of that. Do you agree with sort of Zuckerberg and Trump, which is fine if the answer is yes, that that second group, while it might be sort of emotionally hurtful, is legal and part of free speech, and therefore doesn't need human fact checking?
I agree with it for 4 reasons, none of which are legal.
Okay.
So I'll lay out 4 reasons for this.
Yeah.
First one, and I think this is the one that people talk about the most, and it probably is the strongest, which is I think it really does destroy people's trust in institutions to know that there's a gatekeeper between them and whatever is true that they don't know anything about, who's monitoring and policing content, and they don't know what their motivation is. I think that creates speculation. I think it creates paranoia. Mm-hmm. And I think unelected gatekeepers are by nature problematic. I mean, I think the paternalism is potentially worrisome, and it's certainly worrisome for people who don't know or necessarily trust the motivations. So I think that's problem 1. I think problem 2 is that the content itself, the moderation is going to be necessarily what they say under-inclusive and over-inclusive, right? It's going to miss stuff anyway, which leads people to believe that it's missing stuff in a biased or, unfair way, that some types of content that's just missed is intentionally missed, which is almost certainly untrue, but possibly. More importantly, it's going to miss out on the fact that people are unnecessary. This is the third point. People are by nature recursive. They use satire. They inoculate things by reframing it. They take and adapt stuff that may have been problematic in ways that is not problematic. And all of that human creative content then gets missed. And I think that's problematic. And I think that the fourth thing, and I think this is a multiple channels, multiple media argument, is I think people necessarily gravitate towards freedom one way or the other. So the more freedom you provide, the more people you will keep engaged. And if people are going to gravitate towards freedom, you should be providing freedom.
Okay. I think that is all fair. Let me tell you where I see a distinction and see if you agree. So you made a clear distinction that seemed to me to be almost inarguable, right? That beheadings and things like that shouldn't be shown. Fine. I would say that I agree that for the reasons you laid out, human beings deciding this political speech is okay, this political speech is not okay. These cultural norms are okay to talk about and these are not. Like, doesn't work for lots of different reasons. Where I come at a lot of this, though, as you know, is in the harm caused, especially to children, by toxic content on the internet, right? Content that encourages them to cut themselves, to engage in eating disorders, that leads to massive increases in teenage suicide, tremendous cyberbullying, all the same things that caused Australia a few weeks ago to ban social media entirely for people under the age of 16. I believe it is very important to have some ability to try to really police that. Now, I think the best way to do that ultimately would be to repeal Section 230 and let the courts establish jurisprudence around all of this, but at least until then. And I don't know, maybe AI is a perfectly useful or even better tool to do that, but where do you put that into that metric or that dynamic?
So I'm going to introduce one other idea and I think that'll explain where I come out with your point on how do you protect people who really aren't, who may not be ready for content. And I think the point I would introduce is that free speech is great, and the Zuckerberg kind of unadorned free speech is great, but speech requires context. So if somebody says something that is like a clear dog whistle, but you're unfamiliar with the cultural context of the dog whistle, something that may be really harmful or really hurtful to someone else. I'll give you an example. It's like a really close one, From the River to the Sea. If you're a college student from Iowa and your only context with rivers is the bridges of Madison County, you're missing the conversation, and you need the context. So I think one of the things that even Facebook and even Zuckerberg and Meta is doing right now is keeping in strong community notes so that they can provide context to conversations. And I think the point of that being, and I think that's a good thing, I think AI actually does a really good job of it because AI is really good at providing context in a digestible fashion, in a quick fashion. And it's also faster, which is important for getting the context up. Where I think that matters for kids is I think parents possibly on a kid by kid basis need to have an understanding of, is the person that I'm dealing with mature enough to understand these points with the appropriate context? And do we think that some of the conversation topics, even with appropriate context, are too sensitive for them? If we think the latter, then there should be a ban. If we think the former, that they can understand the context and that they can, if we don't think they're ready for the context, we should also have a ban.
Right.
That
What would the prima facie evidence be here? If you have a massive increase in teenage suicide, they clearly are not able to handle the context appropriately,
or they're not getting, or they're not getting the right context, or some of the things that we think of, and this is the part I think that's the hardest, and we'll have to learn over time. Some of the things that we think of as being just controversial points are really like that first type of speech act, where it's, some language or some subliminal thing is really causing people to make decisions that are not in their long-term best interest. Obviously, killing yourself is, stipulate, not in your long-term best interest.
Right. I mean, I just think, look, you're the parent of teenagers. I'm the parent of teenagers. Hugo sitting here is the parent of teenagers. Like, teenagers lack the fundamental ability to kind of have the maturity and perspective to put context in situations. And so therefore they act on very, very limited information and a lot of emotions and a lot of hormones, and make really, really bad choices. And even if it's not flat out suicide, there's still a lot of self-harm involved. So why couldn't we just say, if you were under the age of 18, you are automatically a protected class here? And again, I don't think it's really about political speech. Like, even From the River to the Sea, which I find is offensive personally, right? Because I believe that says that I shouldn't exist as a Jew. I wouldn't ban that, right? But things that are showing young girls, the best ways to cut themselves, like, I don't see any world where that should be allowed. Why can't you just have a flat out ban on stuff like that?
I think the challenge is where is the boundary for stuff like that?
You got to be over inclusive in this scenario. Why would protecting kids ever make you say, well, I want to be fair to this, artistic right of this content creator over a kid that is literally slashing their veins?
And look, I personally believe that videos of kids cutting themselves are graphic videos that are in the first category from the get-go.
Yeah.
I don't know how they would ever. I don't know how you would see that.
Right.
And say that
what
that's
about
not
content where kids are just telling other kids how to sort of best have eating disorders?
I agree with you, and I like this is one, and this is where it's hard, and this is where I think I probably disagree with you to some extent. Like at some point, you have to give kids the opportunity or the engagement to really engage with context. And part of the problem, I would argue, is that there's not, where you get these things, you don't have a strong enough community note system to say these things that people are saying about how to cut yourself lead to long-term, negative things. They could be very harmful
and
for
the
you.
community notes
And
of
if
other
you're
teenagers.
interested in this, here's where you can seek help.
Yeah, but that shit never works. And the community notes in this case are other teenagers who also lack any context or perspective.
Right. No, and look, there are places with kids, particularly, where this is hard, and people are looking at, do we change the boundaries?
Right. But
that is the case where if you think that people lack the context to do it, then it doesn't. Then that system doesn't work, and that's where you do look at bans of certain age groups.
Yeah.
It's hard though because there are a lot of kids. Like I have 3 kids, right? My 3 kids will all engage with social media differently. And the one-size-fits-all approach to them is probably not right. Some of them will have different needs with regard to bans as others. And I have this conversation with them, and it's a tough conversation because one-size-fits-all doesn't work. But as a society, we need one-size-fits-all approaches because otherwise it's unmanageable for a platform.
Yeah, and I would say it seems to me, like, interestingly, I think if you had asked me this a few weeks ago that this was going to happen and I had to predict where you and I would both land, and then where I think we did land is, I think we both feel like when it comes to political speech, what Zuckerberg is doing is fine, right? That the community fact-checking doesn't work anyway, and there are certain rights to free speech, and therefore things that are upsetting or triggering shouldn't necessarily be banned. You were also both in clear agreement that anything that is explicitly sort of brutal, like beheadings, should be. And then I think where we maybe are a little bit in disagreement is I would argue for just much more over-inclusivity when it comes to protecting kids, even at the expense of some First Amendment rights and even at the expense of, not teaching them more about context.
And maybe the argument is, and this is hard for Meta, but maybe the argument is if you are able to determine that a certain set of posts are targeted at kids rather than targeted at adults, that maybe that's the pathway and not just the outright ban of the content.
Yeah.
So it's really looking at intention and target within.
Yeah.
Or if you see that like 70% of these are being viewed by people that you have reason to believe based on your algorithm are under 18, that might be something else that requires higher inclusivity.
Right. And by the way,
these are both doable concepts. They should just be explored.
Yeah. And by the way, this would also argue a new path for the repeal of Section 30 would be, rather than a full-out repeal, say, liability occurs for protected class minors or something like that, right? Where it's very specific. Mm-hmm. And then you sort of avoid all the political speech stuff and you're just into that. And I know that the platforms obviously don't ever want to be liable for anything ever, but I feel like that they could, with AI tools, basically manage to protect themselves and if they take it seriously. So it would seem like you could get to a good outcome here.
Well, the other thing about liability is it's the damn effect. You fight liability forever, and when it comes, it's overwhelming. I mean, we saw this with asbestos. We see it with tobacco.
Yeah, sure.
Better to
but that leads to good outcomes.
Liability earlier,
right?
Yeah,
but the dam opening is usually ends up being a good outcome in these cases.
Right, and it may very well be a good outcome in this case. I'm just saying, if I knowing what I know now, if I were Meta or X, I would want to have limited liability sooner, rather than waiting for the dam to break and having
agreed. I suspect that's not what they'll do, but I agree with you.
Right. So. I don't think it's what they'll do either. It's not human nature, but it's actually the right outcome.
Agreed. All right, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that was Bob. All right, I don't really have recommendations this week. I'm reading a lot of stuff, and it's a bunch of movies and TV shows. So
the Gotham Book Prize is in high gear too, right?
Well, we're getting our nominations from the jury, and I've submitted my nomination, and we will convene in April to vote, and then we will probably award it like in May or something like that.
Nice. Okay. Have a good trip, Bradley.
See you. Thank you. Firewall is recorded at my bookstore, P&T Knitwear, located at 180 Orchard Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We'd love to hear from you with questions, feedbacks, or idea for a guest. Just email me at bradley@firewall.media or find me on LinkedIn. And to keep up with what's on my mind and my latest writing, please follow my new Substack at bradleytuss.substack.com. Thanks again for listening.